Indiana Fever guard Caitlin Clark recently offered one of the more candid assessments of her team's early season struggles, and her diagnosis had little to do with shooting percentages or offensive rhythm. Her concern was more fundamental. The team's defensive effort, she said, remains too dependent on whether the offense is working. That observation carries weight, particularly coming from a player in her second professional season. Clark did not frame it as criticism of her teammates. She framed it as a structural problem, one the team needs to address before it becomes a defining characteristic. The issue she described is a recognizable pattern in young professional rosters. When shots are falling, energy rises. Players communicate, rotations tighten, and the pace of play improves. When the offense stalls, defensive intensity tends to follow it downward. The result is a team whose competitive engagement fluctuates based on external momentum rather than internal discipline. That is the habit Clark identified. And by naming it directly, she signaled an awareness of team dynamics that goes beyond individual performance. Indiana this season has shown the ability to score in volume. Even during stretches when the offense appears disorganized, the Fever can produce extended scoring runs without much warning. The offensive ceiling is not in question. What Clark pointed to is the floor. Specifically, the team's tendency to lose defensive structure when points stop coming. That inconsistency creates games defined by large momentum swings. The Fever fall behind, often due to defensive breakdowns, then recover through offensive bursts. The pattern repeats. It produces exciting games by certain measures, but it also reflects an absence of the game-to-game discipline that distinguishes competitive teams from inconsistent ones. Clark spoke about this specifically in the context of transition basketball. Her point was straightforward. When Indiana defends well and generates stops, the team runs more effectively, spacing opens, and the offense becomes more fluid. Defense in that sense is not separate from offensive success. It is a precondition for it. The Fever have been trying to reverse that sequence, hoping offensive momentum generates defensive energy. Clark's view is that it needs to work the other direction. That is not an unusual observation from a basketball standpoint. It reflects a fairly standard principle in how well-coached teams build competitive stability. What is notable is that Clark is articulating it this early in her career, and doing so publicly. Most players at her stage of professional development tend to emphasize personal adjustments, shot selection, conditioning, acclimating to the pace of the professional game. Clark has done some of that, but increasingly her post-game comments focus on team habits rather than individual statistics. Even following games in which she scored at a high rate, she returned in her remarks to defensive consistency and what the team needs to do differently when the ball is not going in. That redirection is a meaningful signal. Players who begin measuring their performance against team outcomes rather than personal metrics tend to influence team culture over time. Whether that influence translates quickly depends on many variables, but the orientation itself matters. Head coach Stephanie White's comments after recent games echoed Clark's framing. White spoke about attention to detail, communication lapses, and defensive positioning, not athleticism or talent. The implication was clear. The coaching staff believes this roster is capable of more consistent defensive performance. The shortfall is not physical. It is a matter of focus and discipline. That distinction is important. When a coaching staff identifies talent gaps, the solutions are structural: roster adjustments, lineup changes, developmental timelines. When the gap is discipline, the solution is behavioral. It requires buy-in, consistency of effort, and the willingness of players to perform at a high level in moments that receive no recognition. Defense by its nature is mostly invisible in the metrics that drive attention. No one shares a clip of a properly executed rotation. The work that prevents transition opportunities does not generate highlight footage. For young players on a high-profile team, the pull toward offensive production is real. Not because they are indifferent to winning, but because offensive contributions are the ones most clearly registered in coverage, in fan reaction, and in the way professional performance tends to get evaluated publicly. Clark's comments suggest she understands this dynamic and is pushing against it. She also directed accountability inward. On finishing at the rim, on shot selection, on moments of hesitation, she addressed her own performance directly. That matters in a locker room context. It is considerably easier for a coaching staff to demand discipline and consistency when the team's most prominent player is applying the same standard to herself. The broader challenge for Indiana is one that many young rosters face. Translating offensive potential into wins requires establishing a defensive identity that holds independent of whether the offense is functioning well. The Fever have not yet reached that point. They are capable of defensive intensity in stretches, but sustaining it across 40 minutes, particularly in stretches when the offense is cold, has been inconsistent. Clark described this as a habit. That framing is accurate. Habits in professional sports are patterns that persist under pressure, which means the only way to change them is through repetition under competitive conditions. Awareness, as she would likely acknowledge, is not the same as resolution. The conditions of a long professional season are also worth considering. Playing emotionally reactive basketball, performing well during positive momentum and falling off during negative momentum creates cumulative fatigue that goes beyond the physical. The mental cost of regularly needing large fourth-quarter runs to stay competitive adds up over the course of a season. Teams that operate this way late in a season tend to show it in close games and in playoff settings, where opponents are better equipped to disrupt offensive rhythm and exploit defensive inconsistencies. Clark's concern, taken seriously, is not just about game-to-game results. It is about whether Indiana can build the kind of consistency that holds when games are difficult and ugly and the crowd is quiet. Those are the games that define rosters over a full season. On the offensive side, Indiana's capability is evident enough that it tends to obscure the defensive problems in the short term. A run of made shots can make a 7-minute stretch of poor defensive positioning look manageable on the scoreboard. But over the course of a game, and certainly over the course of a season, those patterns become legible. Opposing coaching staffs have already identified Indiana's rhythm. Teams that can disrupt the Fever's offensive flow early, prevent transition opportunities, and keep the game in a controlled half-court setting put Indiana in a position where its defensive fragility becomes a factor. The counter is for Indiana to defend well enough that it does not need its offense to generate competitive energy. Clark is pointing toward that adjustment explicitly. What makes her public candor notable is the context. The Fever are a team with significant media attention, a growing fan base, and commercial stakes that attach themselves to narrative. In that environment, athletes typically manage their public statements carefully, avoiding criticism of team performance, keeping frustration internal, redirecting toward positives. Clark has done some of that, but she has also been willing to name problems directly.
There is a leadership dynamic in that choice. Players who are honest about team weaknesses and who include themselves in the critique tend to set a different kind of expectation in a locker room than players who protect their public image at the expense of candor. The former creates accountability, the latter creates distance. It is worth noting that the expectations around Indiana were always going to be high, and managing those expectations while simultaneously trying to build competitive habits is a real challenge. The franchise has added talent, generated enormous public interest, and operates under the assumption that it should be competitive at the highest level of the league. That pressure can accelerate development, but it can also create an environment where short-term results feel more urgent than long-term construction. Clark's comments operate against that pressure in a specific way. By emphasizing habits and discipline over outcomes, she is arguing for the slower, less visible work. The kind that does not show up in any single game, but that accumulates into the kind of team identity that holds under postseason conditions. Indiana's offensive talent means the team will continue to be competitive in individual games regardless of how the defensive habits evolve. The floor is high enough that the Fever will generate attention and excitement throughout the season. But Clark's point is about something beyond that, about what this team is actually capable of becoming and what it needs to do to get there. The gap between what Indiana shows in its best moments and what it sustains across a full game is the central question the franchise is working through right now. It is not unusual for a young team to face that gap. What is less common is for a player this early in her career to articulate it with this degree of clarity. Clark has not suggested the problem is unsolvable. Her framing was not fatalistic. She identified a specific habit, defensive effort conditioned on offensive success, and argued it needs to change. That is a constructive diagnosis. It points towards something fixable, even if fixing it is not simple. For the Fever to reach the level Clark appears to be orienting toward, the team will need to demonstrate the ability to defend when the game is going poorly, to execute rotations and maintain communication during cold stretches, to play with competitive intensity in moments that generate no momentum and no recognition. That is the version of Indiana Clark is asking for. Whether this group can build it this season remains an open question. But the fact that her attention is there on discipline, on process, on team identity, rather than on her own numbers or on the external factors that can always serve as explanations, says something about how her role in this franchise is developing. The Fever are still a young team finding its competitive character. Clark is becoming one of the more honest voices in the league about what that process actually requires.